Hello everyone! Tonight we are leaving the comfort of central heating and soft mattresses. We are heading north, to a place where the sun is often just a rumour, and the dampness feels like a permanent member of the family. We are going to the Viking Age, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only do it if you genuinely enjoy the idea of wearing itchy wool that never quite dries. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is awake while the rest of the world sleeps. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan to simulate that cold draft coming through the timber walls. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you hear the word Viking, you probably have a very specific image in your head. A muscular warrior, screaming on the prow of a longship, axe in hand, ready to conquer a kingdom before lunch. You imagine glory, you imagine the golden halls of Valhalla. But the reality of the Viking Age, well, the reality was mostly about trying to stay warm while smelling absolutely terrible. If you were dropped into 9th century Scandinavia, the first thing to hit you wouldn't be a sword, it would be the smell. Because being a Viking meant essentially living in a barn that you shared with your entire extended family. Let's talk about where you would sleep. The Viking longhouse. It sounds majestic, doesn't it? Like a grand hall from a fantasy novel. In reality, it was a long, windowless wooden tunnel with a dirt floor. There were no chimneys. They just lit a fire in the middle of the floor and hoped the smoke would find its way out through a small hole in the roof. Spoiler alert, the smoke rarely found the way out, so your life was lived in a permanent haze of wood smoke. You would have red, watery eyes constantly. Archaeologists have found that many Vikings had severe lung damage just from breathing in their own homes. It was like sleeping inside a barbecue grill every single night, and you weren't alone in there. Privacy is a modern invention. In the longhouse, you slept on a raised wooden bench along the wall, shoulder to shoulder, with your parents, your children, your cousins, and your slaves. But wait, there's more. In the deep winter, the cows, goats, and sheep were brought inside too, usually just separated by a low wall at the end of the hall. The Vikings did this to keep the animals from freezing, but also because the body heat of a cow is a great radiator. This added a certain texture to the air. A mixture of soot, wet dog, unwashed humanity and manure. To us this is a biohazard. To a Viking this was just a Tuesday night. It gets wet and isn't treated perfectly. It rots or stiffens into a board. No, you wore wool, layers and layers of wool. Now wool is a miracle fabric. It keeps you warm even when wet. But have you ever worn rough homespun wool directly against your sensitive skin for 3 months straight? It itches, it is heavy, and when it gets wet, say from sailing across the North Sea in an open boat with freezing spray, hitting you for days, it smells like a wet sheep that has given up on life. And because drying clothes in a damp climate without electricity is nearly impossible, you were just damp, constantly. A low-level, bone-chilling moisture that settled into your joints and never left. Arthritis wasn't an old person's disease, it was a companion that arrived in your 30s. While you sat in your smoky house shivering in your wet wool, you were never truly alone. You had passengers. Lice were not an occasional annoyance, they were a universal experience. Every Viking, from the lowest slave to the mightiest jarl, had lice. Archaeologists have found Viking combs in huge numbers. They are beautiful, often carved from antler or bone, but they weren't just for vanity. They were tools of war, a daily war against the itch. Imagine trying to sleep while dozens of tiny creatures are hosting a festival on your scalp, and not just your scalp. Body lice lived in the seams of that wool clothing we talked about. Since washing wool in freezing water was difficult, the lice stayed. So if you ever fantasize about travelling back in time to date a Viking, just remember, you wouldn't just be dating him. You would be dating him and his entire ecosystem of parasites. We cannot talk about daily life without talking about the bathroom. or the lack thereof. Vikings were actually cleaner than many other Europeans of the time. They bathed once a week. But cleaner is a relative term. When nature called, you didn't have porcelain or plumbing. You had a cesspit, a hole in the ground, sometimes lined with wood, usually located just outside the house. In the freezing cold of a Scandinavian January, going to the bathroom was a test of courage. And toilet paper? That's a futuristic luxury. You used what was available. In the Viking Age, that usually meant moss. Yes, damp, cold moss collected from the forest floor. It was soft, absorbent, and arguably better than the ceramic shards the Romans used. But it was still moss. And if you weren't careful about which moss you picked, you might introduce a whole new family of insects to your most private areas. After a long day of scratching lice and surviving the latrine, you would probably be hungry. Don't expect a feast. The Viking diet was fueled by one main fear: starving before spring. You would likely eat skyr, a type of sour yogurt which was actually quite healthy, but mostly you ate porridge. Grey, lumpy barley porridge, every single day. If you were lucky, you had dried fish, stockfish. This is cod that has been dried in the cold wind until it has the consistency of a roof shingle. It becomes hard as wood. To eat it, you literally have to beat it with a hammer to break the fibres. You have to assault your dinner just to make it chewable, and even then, chewing it was a workout for your jaw. This is why Vikings had very strong jaw muscles, not from screaming in battle, but from trying to eat their preserved fish. There were no spices, no sugar, just salt, if you were wealthy enough to trade for it, and the flavour of smoke, always the smoke. But what if you got sick or wounded? Viking medicine was a mix of superstition, herbal knowledge, and terrifying practicality. Let's say you were a warrior who just came back from a raid. You have a deep wound in your belly. Today you would get a CT scan. In the Viking Age, you got the onion soup test. The healer would feed you a bowl of very strong, pungent onion and leek soup. Then they would wait for a while. After some time, the healer would lean in close and smell your wound. If they could smell the onions coming from the cut in your stomach, that was it. It meant your intestines were pierced. There was no surgery to fix that. If the wound smelled like onions, you were simply made comfortable and left to die. It was a brutal binary diagnosis. You either healed or you didn't. So the next time you feel bored with your modern life, or you think you were born in the wrong generation, just take a deep breath. Smell the clean air of your room. Feel the dry, soft fabric of your clothes. Appreciate the fact that you don't have to beat your dinner with a hammer. The Vikings were tough, incredible survivors, but their reality was a world of grey skies, gnawing hunger, and perpetual cold. A world we are lucky to visit only in our dreams. Sleep well. We often romanticize the Viking longships, the dragon heads, the steed, the adventure. But let's talk about the reality of crossing the North Sea in an open wooden boat. There were no cabins, there was no below deck. You sat on a hard wooden chest that contained all your worldly possessions, and you rowed, for hours, till your hands blistered and bled, and then you rowed some more. The North Sea is not a calm swimming pool. It is a violent, freezing beast. Waves would constantly crash over the side, soaking you in salt water. If you have ever had a small cut on your hand and got salt juice in it, you know the pain. Now imagine that over your entire body, chafing against wet wool for 3 weeks. The salt sores were agonizing. And let's not forget seasickness. Picture 50 burly men packed shoulder to shoulder, riding 10-foot waves, vomiting over the side, or worse, inside the boat because the storm was too rough to stand up. The smell of a longship wasn't adventure. It was vomit, unwashed bodies, and fear. Perhaps the hardest enemy the Vikings faced wasn't the Saxons or the Franks. It was the winter darkness. We have light bulbs. They had flickering tallow lamps that smelled like burning fat. In the deep Scandinavian winter, the sun rises at 10 a.m. and sets at 2:30 p.m. That leaves about 18 hours of crushing darkness every single day for months. Today we call the psychological effect of this seasonal affective disorder. The Vikings just called it life. You would sit in the longhouse listening to the wind howl, repairing your tools, telling the same stories you told last year and the year before that. The boredom was lethal. Depression was rampant. Alcohol became the only escape. They drank mead and weak beer, not just to celebrate, but to numb the crushing reality of a world without light. Waiting. Just waiting for the sun to return. Now, let's assume you weren't a warrior. Let's assume you were unlucky enough to be a thrall, a slave, because Viking society ran on slavery. If being a free Viking was hard, being a thrall was a horror story. You were the one who had to clean the cesspits. You were the one who had to shear the sheep in the freezing rain. You slept on the dirt floor near the door where the draft was coldest. You were considered property, worth less than a good sword. If your master died, sometimes a thrall would be volunteered to join him in the grave to serve him in the afterlife. So your daily anxiety wasn't just about hunger or cold, it was about hoping your master stayed healthy, because his death could literally be the end of you. We mentioned the food being hard, but let's talk about the teeth. Viking skeletons tell a painful story. Their teeth were often worn down to stumps from chewing coarse grain and grit that got into the flour from the stone mills. Abscesses, pockets of infection in the jaw, were common killers. But they also engaged in some terrifying dentistry on purpose. Archaeologists have found Viking skulls with horizontal lines filed into their front teeth, deep grooves carved into the enamel. We think they filled these grooves with red pigment or charcoal to look scary in battle. Just imagine the sensation of having your front teeth filed down with a rough stone without anesthesia, just to look fashionable. It makes modern braces seem like a spa treatment. Finally, let's consider childhood. If you managed to reach adulthood in the Viking Age, you were already a statistical miracle. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Perhaps 50% of children didn't see their 10th birthday. A simple ear infection could kill you. A bad tooth could kill you. Drinking the wrong water could kill you. Children were put to work as soon as they could walk. There was no school, no playground. Your education consisted of learning how not to freeze, how to kill a fish, and how to keep the fire lit. It was a childhood of labour, short days and long nights. So when we look back at the Vikings, let's respect their resilience. Because enduring that level of discomfort, pain and darkness required a strength that modern humans can barely comprehend. We leave the freezing north now and travel south, to the eternal city, Rome. You probably imagine white marble columns, men in clean togas discussing philosophy under the sun and the grandeur of the empire. But that Rome was only for the top 1%. For the other 99% of the population, Rome wasn't marble. It was mud, brick, timber, and suffocating overcrowding. Tonight we are going to walk through the Suburra, the slums of Rome, where the rent was astronomically high, the walls were terrifyingly thin, and the smell was something history books try to forget. If you lived in Rome, you didn't live in a villa. You lived in an insula, an ancient apartment block. These were massive structures, 6 or 7 stories high, built by greedy landlords who used cheap timber and unbaked bricks to maximize profit. There were no elevators, and strangely, the higher you lived, the poorer you were. The ground floor had running water and little danger. The top floor, the cenaculum, was a death trap. Why? Because in a fire, which happened constantly in Rome due to oil lamps and open kitchens, you were the least likely to escape. Living on the top floor meant walking up hundreds of creaky, rotting wooden steps every single day. And there was no running water up there. If you wanted water, you carried it up, bucket by bucket. If you needed to use the bathroom, well, gravity was your only plumbing. This brings us to the most dangerous part of a night walk in Rome, the windows. Since there was no plumbing in the upper apartments, people used chamber pots, and when they were full in the middle of the night, they didn't walk down 6 flights of stairs to empty them. They simply opened the window and threw the contents into the street. There was actually a Roman law that detailed exactly how much money you could sue for if you were hit by waste thrown from a window. The fact that they needed a specific legal code for this tells you exactly how often it happened. So walking in Rome meant constantly looking up, listening for the creak of a shutter, hoping tonight wasn't the night you were baptized by a stranger's dinner from yesterday. The streets were not paved with gold, they were paved with mud, waste and broken pottery. But what if you were out in the city during the day and nature called? You went to the public latrines. Roman latrines are famous for their engineering, but let's look at the user experience. Imagine a long stone bench with keyhole-shaped holes cut into it. No stalls, no dividers, you sat thigh to thigh with strangers staring at them, and discussing politics or the price of grain while doing your most private business. And how did you clean yourself afterwards? There was no toilet paper. In front of you there was a small channel of running water. In that water floated a stick with a sea sponge tied to the end. The xylospongium. You picked up the stick, you used the sponge, you rinsed it in the water channel, and then, this is the important part, you put it back for the next person to use. A communal sponge, shared by hundreds of strangers. The spread of bacteria, parasites and disease in these places was catastrophic. It is a miracle the empire lasted as long as it did. You might think Roman food was grapes, wine and exotic birds. For the poor it was wheat, every day. Boiled wheat, baked wheat, wheat porridge. If you bought meat, it was likely sausages of dubious origin sold at street corners, often made from animals that hadn't exactly passed a health inspection. But the Romans had a secret weapon to make this bland, rotting food edible. Garum. Garum was the ketchup of the ancient world. It was a fish sauce made by taking fish intestines and blood, putting them in a barrel with salt, and letting them ferment in the hot sun for months until they turned into a liquid salty sludge. It smelled incredibly strong, but Romans put it on everything, even desserts. It was the only way to mask the taste of food that was slowly going bad. Let's talk about sleep, or rather the impossibility of it. Ancient Rome was the original city that never slept, but not in a fun way. During the day, the streets were so crowded with people that carts and wagons were banned. This meant that all commercial deliveries, food, building materials, timber, had to happen at night. From sunset to sunrise, the city rumbled with the sound of iron wheels on cobblestones, the shouting of drivers, the braying of donkeys, and the construction work that never ended. The poet Martial wrote that in Rome there is no place for a poor man to think or to sleep, and while the poor couldn't sleep, the rich were slowly poisoning themselves. The Romans loved lead. They used lead for their water pipes. The word plumbing comes from plumbum, the Latin word for lead. They lined their wine jars with lead to make the wine taste sweeter. They used lead in their makeup to make their skin look pale. The upper class was suffering from chronic lead poisoning. Symptoms included gout, infertility, madness, and extreme irritability. So looking back at Rome, we see the aqueducts and the Colosseum. We see the glory. But the reality was a city of open sewers, falling buildings, deafening noise, and communal sponges. It was a civilization built on the backs of slaves and the suffering of the poor. Good night. We move forward now to the 19th century, to the capital of the world, London, but I don't want you to imagine the fancy balls of Bridgerton or clean paved streets. I want you to imagine a fog so thick and yellow you can taste the sulphur on your tongue. They called it a pea souper. This wasn't natural mist. It was a chemical soup of coal smoke from 1,000,000 chimneys, mixed with river fog and industrial fumes. If you were walking home at night, You often couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The street lamps were just dim orange halos that failed to pierce the gloom. People literally walked into the river and drowned because they couldn't tell where the street ended and the Thames began. When you blew your nose into a handkerchief, the residue was black. Your lungs were slowly turning into coal sacks. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. The defining feature of Victorian London was not the chiming of Big Ben, it was the smell. In the summer of 1858, it got so bad that history officially named it the Great Stink. The River Thames was essentially an open sewer. All the waste, human, animal, and industrial, from millions of people went directly into the water. The sun baked this mixture until the river fermented. It turned a thick, opaque brown colour. The smell was so powerful that Parliament had to soak their curtains in chloride of lime just to stop the politicians from vomiting during debates. They even considered moving the government to Oxford just to escape the fumes. And the worst part, this was the same water source many poor districts used for drinking. A glass of water in London wasn't clear, it was a biology experiment. If you were poor, you lived in the rookeries. Slums so crowded they defied logic. Imagine a single room, no bigger than a modern parking space. Now put 3 families in it. People slept in shifts. Some slept under the bed, some on the bed, some standing up, leaning against a rope. A literal 2-penny hangover. The walls leaked moisture. The wallpaper peeled from the damp. Rats were not pests, they were roommates. In these alleys, sunlight never touched the ground. The buildings leaned toward each other until they almost touched at the roof, creating eternal twilight below. It was a world of doze, mud, and ginnah. Now let's talk about jobs. If you were a child in Victorian London, you didn't go to school, you worked, and the worst job of all was the chimney sweep. Because chimneys were narrow and twisted, adults couldn't fit. So they sent small children, sometimes as young as 5, to climb up inside the soot-choked flues. These were the climbing boys. It was dark, claustrophobic and hot. Many children got stuck and suffocated. Others developed cancer from the constant exposure to soot rubbing against their skin. They didn't wear protective gear. They climbed naked or in rags to avoid getting stuck, scraping their elbows and knees against the rough brick, breathing in black dust every day of their short lives. If you lost your job or got sick, there was no welfare. There was only the workhouse. This was a prison for being poor. The government made them intentionally miserable so that people would do anything to avoid them. Families were separated at the door. You wore a scratchy prison-like uniform, and you spent 10 hours a day doing useless, back-breaking labour, like breaking rocks into gravel or picking apart old tar-covered ropes, a job called picking oakum that made your fingers bleed. The food, gruel, basically water with some floating oats. It was a life of grey walls, grey food, and absolutely no hope. The silence in the workhouse was heavy, broken only by the sound of coughing. Disease was the true ruler of London. Cholera didn't care if you were rich or poor, it struck fast. One moment you were healthy, hours later you were dehydrated and blue. Doctors didn't know about germs yet. They thought bad air caused sickness. So while you were dying of contaminated water, they would close the windows to keep the air out, sealing you in with the disease. Operations were done on kitchen tables. Anesthesia was rare or non-existent for the poor. A swig of gin and a leather strap to bite on were your only friends if a leg needed to be amputated. Survival was a matter of luck, not medicine. So, when you look at old photos of Victorians looking stern and unsmiling, maybe it wasn't just the long exposure time, maybe it was because they were hungry, their teeth hurt, their lungs were full of coal and they were standing in mud. The Victorian era built the modern world, but it was built on a foundation of bone, soot and silence. Take a deep breath of clean air, drink a glass of clear water, and sleep well knowing the fog is outside, not in your lungs. Good night. But sometimes the Lord demands more than your grain. He demands your blood. War comes, you are not a knight. You don't have shining armour or a warhorse, you are a levy, an infantryman. You're told to bring your own weapons. You take your axe or a spear or a knife. You wear a gambeson, a padded jacket made of layers of linen stuffed with wool or horsehair. It is heavy, it smells when it gets wet, and it is your only protection against a sharp steel sword. You march. You walk for weeks, sleeping in ditches, eating hardtack. You don't know where you're going. You don't know why the king is angry at the other king. You just know that if you run away, you'll be hanged. When the battle starts, you are placed in the front. You see the enemy knights charging, thousands of pounds of horse and steel thundering towards you. You realise with terrifying clarity that you are nothing more than a human speed bump. Your job is to die slowly enough to slow them down. If the battle doesn't kill you, the camp will. Imagine 10,000 men with no toilets, no garbage collection, and no hygiene, camping in a muddy field for a month. The water gets contaminated within days. The bloody flux, dysentery sweeps through the tents. You watch your friends waste away, shivering in their own filth, dying of dehydration because the river is poisoned. War is not glory. War is waiting. War is being wet. War is watching men die of diarrhea while the nobles sit in colourful tents drinking wine. If you survive, you walk home. You're thinner. You're scarred. And you go straight back to the plough the next morning because the field doesn't care that you're a veteran. Most peasants are born, live and die within a 5-mile radius. The next village over is a strange place. The people there have a weird accent. You don't trust them. To travel further to the nearest city is a terrifying expedition. There are no maps. There are no road signs. The woods between villages are the wilderness. Outlaws live there. Wolves live there. Under English law, an outlaw is a wolf's head. You can kill him on sight like an animal, but he can kill you too. If you travel, you stick to the road. You pray to St. Christopher. When you see the walls of a city, you are amazed. The smell hits you first, worse than the village. You see stone cathedrals that seem to touch the sky. You cannot comprehend how human hands built them. You feel small. You feel lost. You sell your chickens, buy your salt, and run back to the safety of your mud hut as fast as you can. The world is too big, too loud, and too dangerous. Let's assume you survive. You survive childhood, the plague, the famine, and the war. You are now 45 years old. In the Middle Ages, you're an elder, but your body is a ruin. Your teeth are gone, ground down by the millstone grit. You eat only soft pottage now. Your joints are swollen with arthritis from decades of working in the rain. You walk with a permanent stoop. Your eyesight is failing from years of squinting in the smoky twilight of your cottage. There is no retirement. There is no pension. If you cannot work, you become a burden. You move to the corner of the hearth. You mend nets. You watch the grandchildren. You try to eat as little as possible so the working men can have more. You feel the cold more intensely now. The damp earth floor feels like ice. You wait. You pray. You hope that you have been good enough. Finally, the end comes. Maybe it is a winter chest infection, pneumonia. Maybe your heart simply stops beating from exhaustion. You lie in the straw bed. The priest comes. The room is filled with your family, the cow and the smoke. The priest performs the last rites. He anoints you with the oil. He speaks the Latin words that promise you safety in the next world. You're terrified of purgatory, the place of fire where you must burn off your sins before heaven. You whisper your last confession. You admit to stealing firewood. You admit to working on a saint's day. You admit to hating the miller. The priest absolves you. Your breathing slows. The cold leaves your body. The struggle is over. The mud can no longer touch you. You have completed your shift in the fields of the Lord. Your family washes your body, the first full bath you have had since birth. They wrap you in a simple shroud. They carry you to the churchyard. They dig a hole in the earth you spent your life tilling. They lower you down. The priest says earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and you return to the soil. Next year the grain will grow above your grave, the sheep will graze on the grass, and your son will wake up in the cold dark cottage, light the fire and begin the cycle all over again. Sleep where? Sunday morning, the only time you stop working. You stand in the stone church. There are no pews, you stand or kneel on the cold flagstones. The priest speaks in Latin. You don't understand the word, but you know the magic. The incense covers the smell of unwashed bodies. The stained glass, if the church is rich, or the painted walls glow with colour, the only colour you see in your brown world. You look at the walls. They are painted with the doom. It shows the last judgment. On one side, naked souls are being led to heaven. On the other, demons with claws are dragging sinners into the mouth of a giant beast. Hell. They are boiling people, flaying them. You stare at it. It is the most terrifying movie you have ever seen, and you believe it is real. The church offers you hope of paradise, but it keeps you in line with fear. Obey your Lord, the priest says. Accept your station. You are told that your poverty is God's will, that trying to change it is a sin against the natural order. So you bow your head, you accept the mud, you accept the hunger, because 40 years of misery is a small price to pay to avoid the painted demons on the wall. Let's talk about justice, or rather the lack of it. Every few weeks you must attend the manor court. It is held in the Lord's Hall or under a great tree. You dread it. The manor court is not about justice, it is about income for the Lord. It is a machine designed to extract pennies from empty pockets. You stand there, cap in hand, while the steward reads the list of crimes. Did your cow stray into the Lord's meadow? Fined 2 pennies. Did you brew ale without paying the tax? Fined 3 pennies. Did your daughter get married without the Lord's permission? That is the Merchet fine, and it can cost you a year's wages. Did you die? Even death is taxed. It is called the Heriot. When you die, the Lord legally takes your best animal. Your widow is left grieving, and the bailiff walks in and takes the family's only ox. You watch your neighbours being fined for fighting, for baking bad bread, for not sharpening their ploughshares. You realise that every aspect of your life, your marriage, your beer, your death, is a transaction where you lose. You're not a citizen, you're an asset, like a fruit tree that is shaken until every coin falls out. When the sun goes down, the world changes. We are not afraid of the dark because we have switches on the wall. You have nothing, the night is absolute. It is a heavy, suffocating blanket. And in the medieval mind, the dark is not empty, it is full. You believe with absolute certainty in the supernatural. The woods are full of elves and goblins, not the cute ones from fairy tales, but malicious spirits that steal babies and sour milk. The churchyard is full of restless dead. When you sleep, you fear the nightmare. You believe a demon literally sits on your chest, crushing the air out of you. We call it sleep paralysis. You call it a spiritual attack. You keep a piece of iron by the bed. You mutter charms. You cross yourself. If an owl hoots, you shiver. It is an omen of death. If a black dog follows you, it is the devil. You live in a constant state of psychological siege. The physical world hurts you by day, and the spiritual world hunts you by night. There is no safe place. If life is hard for the serf, it is harder for the serf's wife. She works the fields alongside the men during the harvest. She swings the scythe. She binds the wheat. But when the men rest, her work begins. She must grind the grain if the miller is too expensive. Hand-grinding flour takes hours of circular, back-breaking motion. She must carry water. A bucket of water weighs 20 pounds. She carries 2 on a yoke, walking miles from the river to the cottage every day. Her shoulders are permanently bruised. She must spin the wool. She must weave the cloth. She must brew the ale. And she must do all of this while pregnant, or while carrying an infant on her back. Childbirth is the leading killer of women. It is a coin toss with death. If she survives, she's back to milking the cows the next day. There is no maternity leave. There is no rest. She is the first to rise to light the fire, and the last to sleep after mending the clothes. She is the steel backbone of the feudal system, bending but never breaking. How do you cope? How do you face the mud, the fines, and the demons? You drink. Water is dangerous. It gives you flux, diarrhea. Milk is for cheese, wine is for the rich. You drink ale. The alehouse is usually just a neighbour's cottage. A woman puts a broom above her door to signal a fresh batch is ready. You crowd inside. It is dark, loud, and smells of yeast and sweat. You drink from leather mugs or wooden bowls. The ale is thick. It is unfiltered. It is nutritious, full of calories you desperately need. But it is also alcohol. You drink to dull the toothache. You drink to forget the bailiff. You drink to warm your blood against the winter chill. Most of the village is mildly intoxicated most of the time. It is a chemical haze that softens the sharp edges of your reality. For a few hours by the fire laughing with your neighbours, you're not a serf. You're a man, until the morning sun hits your eyes like a hammer. Let's look at what you were wearing, that itchy brown tunic. Where did it come from? You didn't buy it. You made it. Or rather, the women of your family made it. It started as a sheep. First the shearing, wrestling a dirty, oily sheep. Then the washing. To get the grease, lanolin, out of the wool, you need a strong cleaner. You don't have soap, you have stale urine. Yes, the village collects urine in a pot. It is allowed to sit until it turns into ammonia. The women wash the wool in vats of fermented urine. They tread on it with their bare feet. The smell is eye-watering. Then the carding, combing the wool with teasel heads, spiky plants to straighten the fibres. Then the spinning. Every spare moment of a woman's life, walking, sitting, watching children, is spent spinning wool onto a drop spindle. Then the weaving, hours at a loom in the dark cottage. Then the fulling. To make the cloth thick and waterproof, it must be beaten, again in urine and fuller's earth clay. By the time you put that shirt on, it represents thousands of hours of labour. It is thick, stiff, and smells faintly of the barnyard. You will wear it until it literally falls off your body in rags. And even then, you won't throw it away. You will use the rags to stuff cracks in the wall or wrap a baby's bottom. Nothing is wasted because everything costs too much human time. Death is not a stranger. He is a neighbour. You have likely buried half your children. A woman in the village gives birth. It is a moment of terror, not joy. There are no doctors, only the midwife with her herbs and charms. If the baby is sideways, the mother dies. If the mother gets childbed fever from unwashed hands, she dies. You walk through the churchyard every Sunday. You see the mounds of earth. There are no headstones with names. Stone is for the rich, just wooden crosses that rot away in a few years. You know that under that mud lie your father, your first wife, your 3 infant sons. You don't have time to grieve in the modern sense. If you stop working to mourn, the living will starve, so you cry while you plough. You weep while you thresh. Grief is just another burden to carry, like the sack of grain on your back. And you know that one day, perhaps from a cut or a fever, or just sheer exhaustion, you will join them in the mud, and the village will go on without you, the wheel of the seasons turning over your bones. Let's talk about hunger. Real hunger. Not the feeling you get when lunch is an hour late. I mean the hunger gap. This happens in late spring. The winter stores are empty. You've eaten the last of the salted pork. The grain in the bin is dust, but the new crops in the field are not yet ready to harvest. This is the cruelest time. The days are getting longer, demanding more work from your body, but your fuel tank is empty. You look at the green shoots of wheat in the Lord's field. You could eat them. You could sneak out at night and cut some. But if you eat the green corn now, there is no harvest later. Plus, if the reeve catches you, you hang. So you forage, you eat nettle soup, you eat dandelion greens. You peel the bark off trees to chew on the inner cambium layer just to stop your stomach from cramping. Your children stop playing. They sit quietly in the corner of the hut. their eyes large, their limbs thin. You watch them fade day by day. You ration the last pieces of hard, mouldy bread. You give the biggest piece to your son, not because you love him more, but because he is old enough to hold a plough. It is a brutal calculus of survival. You work the fields feeling lightheaded, black spots dancing in your vision. You are literally digesting your own muscle tissue to keep moving. And all around you, the birds are singing and the flowers are blooming. The beauty of spring is a mockery when your belly is hollow. If there is one man you hate more than the tax collector, it is the miller. You cannot grind your own grain. It is illegal. By law, you must take your grain to the Lord's mill, and the miller runs it. He is a figure of suspicion. He lives apart from the village, usually by the river or on the windy hill. You haul your sacks of grain to him. He weighs them, and then he takes his cut, the mulcher. You watch him scoop out a portion of your hard-earned grain for the Lord and another portion for himself. Does he take too much? You think so. Everyone thinks so. They say he has a golden thumb pressing down on the scale to cheat you. They say he mixes chalk or dust into your flour to bulk it up, but you can do nothing. He has the monopoly. You stand in the mill deafened by the grinding stones, breathing in the white flour dust that coats the miller's lungs and eyelashes. He is the only fat man in the village. You hate him, but you need him. You hand over your sacks, watching months of your sweat disappear into his toll bin, and you walk home with less than you arrived with. Finally, August arrives. The harvest. This is not a celebration, it is a rescue mission. You are racing against the rain. If the crop gets wet before you bring it in, it rots and you'll die in the winter. Everyone works. The men, the women, the children, the old. Even the cripples are carried to the field to twist straw ropes. You use a sickle. It is a curved blade. You grab a handful of wheat stalks with your left hand and slice them with your right. Grab, slice, step. Grab, slice, step. You do this 10,000 times a day and your back is bent in a permanent curve. The stubble of the wheat pokes through your thin shoes, cutting your ankles. The sun beats down on your neck. The dust from the chaff fills your nose, your throat, your ears. You itch everywhere. Your hands cramp into claws. If you cut yourself with a sickle, which happens when you're exhausted, you wrap a dirty rag around it and keep cutting. Blood on the wheat doesn't matter. Only the grain matters. And at the end of the day, you don't go home. You sleep in the field guarding the sheaves from thieves or wild animals. You lie on the prickly stubble, too tired to dream, knowing that tomorrow you must do it all again until every last stalk is cut. Let's visit the most terrifying man in the village, the barber surgeon. He's not a doctor, he is a craftsman. He cuts hair, trims beards, and amputates limbs. His tools are displayed on a table, a razor, a saw, pliers, and a bowl. None are clean. They are wiped on his apron, which is stiff with old blood. You go to him because you have a toothache. The gritty bread has cracked a molar. The pain is blinding. You sit on a wooden stool. There is no anaesthetic. He takes the iron pliers. He doesn't wiggle the tooth. He grips it and twists. The sound of the root snapping echoes in your skull. You scream, but he holds you down. He yanks the tooth out. Blood fills your mouth. That will be 2 pennies, he says. You stumble home, spitting blood, dizzy with shock, but the pain is gone. But what if you have a fever? Medical theory says sickness is caused by an imbalance. If you have a fever, you have too much blood, so the treatment is to bleed you. The surgeon takes a small knife. He finds a vein in your arm. Snick. Dark red blood spurts into a bowl. You watch your life fluid drain away. You feel lightheaded. We must let the bad blood out, he says. He takes a pint. You're already malnourished, and now you've lost a litre of blood. It weakens you further. But you thank him. You believe he's saving you. Because in a world without science, faith in the cure is the only thing that keeps you from panic. You finish your meal in silence. The sun is coming. You open the door. The world outside is grey. A thick mist hangs over the village. The road is not a road. It is a scar of deep, sucking mud mixed with animal waste. You walk to the shed to get your tools, a wooden spade tipped with a tiny strip of iron, a wooden rake. They are heavy, blunt and inefficient. They are designed to break your back. You look at your hands. They are covered in calluses so thick they feel like leather gloves. Dirt is ingrained into every crease. You cannot wash it out. It is part of you now. You head to the fields. The fields are not yours. Nothing is yours. You're a serf. You belong to the lord of the manor. He owns the land, the house, the tools, and in many ways your body. You work his land first. That is the deal. 3 days a week you work on the lord's private fields. Only after you have exhausted yourself working for him are you allowed to work the small strip of land that feeds your family. It is a system designed to keep you on the edge of survival. Not dead because a dead serf cannot work, but not comfortable because a comfortable serf might ask questions. The sun is high now, it is noon. Let's talk about your companion in this misery. The ox. You don't have a horse. Horses are for knights. You have an ox. It is a massive, slow, castrated bull. Ploughing a field with an ox is a wrestling match that lasts for 10 hours. The plough is heavy wood. The soil is heavy clay. You have to push the plough with your whole body weight while shouting at the ox. Every step is a battle. Your boots are caked with pounds of wet earth. And then there is the manure. To make crops grow, the land needs fertilizer. There are no chemicals, there is only dung. You spend weeks collecting it. You scoop it from the cowshed, the pig pen, and even your own cesspit. You drag it to the field and spread it with your bare hands. The smell gets into your pores. No matter how much you scrub, you always smell of ammonia. You're fertilizing the food you will eat next year with the waste of this year. Suddenly you hear hoofbeats, fast ones. Riding along the edge of the field is the Lord's bailiff, the tax collector. He's wearing bright colours, red, blue, colours that don't exist in your muddy world. He stops his horse. You take off your hat and bow low. To look him in the eye is insolence. He is calculating the crop yield. Looks like a good harvest, he says. Your heart sinks. A good harvest means he will raise the expectations. If you grow 100 bushels, the Lord takes 50. The church takes 10. You're left with 40 to feed your family. If the bailiff decides you are hiding grain, he can have you whipped. You watch him ride away. The unfairness burns in your chest like bile, but you swallow it. Rebellion means death. So you grip the plough handles and shout at the ox to move. As the sun begins to dip lower, the shadows lengthen. The forest at the edge of the field is forbidden. It belongs to the Lord. If you are caught hunting a deer in there, they will cut off your hand. If you are caught gathering firewood without permission, they will fine you. You see a rabbit hop from the woods into your field. It starts eating the crop you have slaved over. You want to kill it. You want to eat it. Fresh meat. But you hesitate. Is the bailiff watching? You throw a stone to scare it away. You watch a dinner of roast rabbit run away because the risk of losing a hand is too high. That is the reality of serfdom. You're starving in a landscape full of food that you are legally forbidden to touch. The sun sets. The workday is over. You trudge back to the village. Let's talk about your body. You're dirty. Not just, I need a shiver, dirty. You're coated in a layer of grime that has been building up for months. Do you bathe? No. Bathing requires heating gallons of water, which wastes wood. The church also teaches that bathing too often is vanity. So you wipe your face with a wet rag. That's it. The rest of your body remains unwashed. And because you are unwashed, you are an ecosystem. Body lice live in the seams of your wool tunic. When your body heats up from working, they crawl out to feed. You feel them scuttling across your ribs. You spend your evenings picking. You take off your shirt by the firelight and crack the lice between your thumbnails. It's a family activity. And then there are the worms. You drink river water. You have intestinal parasites stealing your nutrients. You are constantly hungry because you're feeding a monster in your gut. Let us drift back now. Let us drift back now. Far back. We're leaving the modern world behind entirely. We are going to the year 1250. We are in rural England or perhaps northern France. It does not matter, because the experience is universally the same. You are not a king. You are not a knight. You are a peasant, a serf. You are part of the 90% of humanity that history books usually ignore. And tonight, we are going to live through your day, minute by agonizing minute. The first thing you notice is not sight, but sensation. It is the cold. Before you even open your eyes, the cold is there. It is a living presence in the room. It is not the crisp, refreshing cold of a modern winter morning. This is a damp, heavy, permeating cold that has settled into the marrow of your bones while you slept. You are lying in bed. But let's describe this bed. It is a large wooden box filled with straw. If you are lucky, the straw was changed last month. If you're unlucky, it has been there since autumn, and it is now a thriving ecosystem of fleas and mites. You're not alone. Privacy does not exist. You're huddled together with your entire family, pressing bodies together under a rough woolen blanket. This human pile is the only heating system you have. You listen. The silence of the cottage is broken by the sound of breathing. Not just human breathing. There is a heavier, deeper sound coming from the corner. Your cow is in the room with you. Your pig is sleeping near the door. In the Middle Ages, animals were radiators. You bring them inside because their body heat raises the temperature. So as you inhale, you fill your lungs with wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the pungent ammonia of manure. To a modern nose, this is a biohazard. To you, it smells like home. You sit up, your joints crack, you are 30 years old, but your body feels 50. A lifetime of heavy lifting has already curved your spine. You slide your legs out of the straw and your bare feet touch the dirt floor. In the winter, it is clammy and cold, sucking the warmth straight out of your soles. You do not change your clothes. You sleep in your clothes, you work in your clothes, you die in your clothes. You're wearing a tunic made of rough, undyed wool, underneath a linen shirt that used to be white years ago. As you move, you feel the fleas in the seams of your tunic. You don't even scratch anymore. You have a truce with them. They bite, you bleed, life goes on, and you stumble to the central hearth. There is no chimney, just a hole in the roof. Smoke fills the room before it escapes. This is why your eyes are always red and why you have a chronic cough. You are living inside a smoker. Now it is time for breakfast. Do not imagine toast. Breakfast is pottage, a thick brown stew that sits in an iron cauldron over the fire, perpetually simmering. You never empty the pot, you just add more water and cabbage to what was left. Some food in that pot might be 3 weeks old. You dip a piece of black rye bread into it. As you chew, you feel the grit. The flour was ground between stone millstones, and tiny particles of rock mixed with the flour. Every time you chew, you're sandpapering your teeth. By the time you're 40, your teeth will be worn flat. But you eat the gritty bread anyway, because the alternative is starvation. Let us step away from the mud of the field for a moment and enter the shadow of the church. Life was not just about physical survival, it was about spiritual survival. And the biggest threat was heresy. Imagine a world where a neighbour's whisper could end your life. The Inquisition. It wasn't just a court, it was a cloud of paranoia that hung over every village. You didn't have to be a witch to be arrested. You just had to be different. Did you mix herbs to cure a headache? Witchcraft. Did you say the Lord's Prayer backwards by mistake because you were tired? Heresy. Did you own a black cat? Suspicious. If the Inquisitors came to your town, the air changed. Everyone stopped talking. They operated on anonymous tips. If you had an argument with your neighbour over a fence, he could report you. You would be dragged from your bed at night, taken to a dungeon, and there, in the dark, they would show you the instruments. The rack, the strappado, the pair of anguish. They didn't always use them immediately. They knew that the fear of pain was often worse than the pain itself. They would leave you in a pitch-black cell for weeks. listening to the screams of others, letting your imagination destroy you. You would confess to anything. You would admit to flying, to kissing the devil, to eating babies, anything to stop the waiting. And the punishment? Fire. Being burned at the stake was designed to be a spectacle. It was slow. So as you lay in your straw bed, you didn't just fear the cold, you feared your own thoughts, you feared your neighbours. You lived in a prison without bars, built by fear. We often dream of living in a medieval castle. Stone walls, tapestries, feasts. But let's look at the reality of the castle. It was a fortress designed for war, not for comfort. It was cold. Stone retains the chill. In winter, the walls would sweat with condensation, and that water would freeze into ice on the inside of your bedroom. The wind howled through the arrow slits, which were too narrow to be covered by glass. To keep warm, they hung tapestries, but behind those tapestries lived colonies of rats and bugs. It was damp, always damp, and it was dark. And the smell, a castle housed hundreds of people, soldiers, servants, nobles, horses, and dogs. The plumbing was the garderobe, a stone chute that emptied into the moat or a cesspit at the base of the wall. On a hot summer day, the smell of human waste rising from the moat would fill the great hall while you tried to eat. And speaking of eating, the kitchens were industrial nightmares. Huge roaring fires made the heat unbearable. Scullery boys, the lowest of the low, spent their lives turning heavy spits of meat, their skin blistered by the fire, their clothes soaked in grease. They slept on the kitchen floor, among the vegetable peelings and the dogs. So castle life wasn't luxury. It was just a slightly more expensive version of being cold and silly. Travel the roads of medieval Europe and you will see markers. Not signposts, but bodies. Justice was brutal and it was public. If you stole a loaf of bread, you might lose an ear or a hand. If you poached a deer, you might be blinded. But for serious crimes, there was the gibbet. This was a metal cage, shaped like a human body. The criminal was placed inside it, alive, and hung from a wooden post at a crossroads. There he would stay, no food, no water. He would die of thirst and exposure over days while travellers walked past beneath him. After death, the body was left there, for months, until the birds picked the bones clean and the skeleton fell apart. This was called the King's Justice. It was meant to be a warning. Imagine walking your children to the market, passing a rotting corpse in a cage, the smell filling the air, the crows circling. Look, you would say, that is what happens when you disobey. The landscape was dotted with these monuments of death, heads on spikes above city gates, bodies hanging from trees. It was a world where the state demonstrated its power by destroying the human body in the most creative and public ways possible. Let's talk about industry. Everything in the Middle Ages was handmade, and some of those hands were always covered in filth. Take leather, your boots, your belt, the night saddle. To make leather soft, it has to be tanned. The tanners lived in a specific part of town, usually downstream because the smell was ungodly. To cure the hide, they used a mixture of urine collected from the town, dog feces collected from the street, and brains. Yes, animal brains. The tanners would stomp on the hides in vats of this mixture with their bare feet for hours. The ammonia from the urine and the bacteria from the feces broke down the collagen in the skin. The pure finders were people whose job was to walk the streets with a bucket, collecting fresh dog poop to sell to the tanners. Imagine that being your career. Imagine the belle of that district. A thick, chemical, fecal fog that stuck to your clothes and hair. The tanners were often outcasts, forced to marry within their own trade because no one else could stand the smell of them. Yet without them, the medieval world would stop. No shoes, no harnesses, no armour straps. It was essential, disgusting work. The defining psychological trait of the medieval mind was the rota fortunae, the wheel of fortune. They believed that fate was random and cruel. One day you are a rich merchant, the next your ship sinks and you are a beggar. One day you're a healthy peasant. The next, the plague strikes, and you are dead. There was no insurance, no safety net, no science to explain why bad things happened. If your barn burned down, it wasn't an accident. It was God's anger, or a witch's curse, or just the wheel turning. This created a society of deep anxiety. You wore amulets. You bought indulgences from the church to buy forgiveness in advance. You touched wood. You threw salt. You lived with the constant gnawing knowledge that everything you loved, your family, your home, your health, could be snatched away in a second, and there was absolutely nothing you could do to stop it. This is why they focused so much on the afterlife, because this life was just a painful waiting room. Let's talk about the Crusades. We imagine knights charging in the desert. But for the common man, a crusade was just a walk, a very, very long walk. Imagine you are a peasant inspired by a preacher to take the cross. You leave your village. You have never been more than 10 miles from home. You walk across France. You walk across the Alps, freezing in your thin tunic. You walk across the Balkans. Your shoes disintegrate. You wrap your feet in rags. You have no map. You just follow the dust cloud of the army ahead of you. You drink from puddles. You sleep on the ground. Diseases sweep through the column. People drop dead from heat stroke, from typhus, from exhaustion. You watch them get left behind on the side of the road. There is no time to bury them, and when you finally reach the Holy Land, the heat hits you like a hammer. You're wearing wool in a desert. You're encased in padded armour. You're not fighting for glory, you are fighting for water. Most crusaders never saw a Saracen sword. They died of thirst or infected blisters, or simply because their bodies gave up after walking 3,000 miles. We talked about doctors using leeches, but where did they get them? Enter the leech collector. This was a real job, and it was usually done by the poorest women. To catch a leech you need bait, and the cheapest bait is you. The collector would walk into a marsh, a bog, or a stagnant pond. She would roll up her skirts. She would wade into the murky cold water with her bare legs, and then she would wait. She would wait for the parasites to smell her blood. She would feel them latch on, the sharp bite, the swelling. She would let them feed for a moment, then pull them off, often leaving a bleeding wound, and put them in a basket. She would do this for hours, until her legs were covered in sores and she was dizzy from blood loss. She sold them to the doctor for pennies. He got the money. She got the scars. It is a stark reminder that every medical miracle of the time was built on the suffering of the poor. If you lived in a medieval city like London or Paris, you lived inside a bonfire waiting to happen. The houses were made of wood, wattle, and pitch, tar. The roofs were thatch, dried straw. The streets were narrow, sometimes only a few feet wide, so the upper stories of houses touched each other across the alley. Inside, everyone used open fires for cooking and heating, candles for light. One spark. That was all it took. If a fire started at night, there was no fire brigade. There were no hydrants. You would wake up to the smell of smoke and the screaming of neighbours. The fire would jump from roof to roof, consuming entire districts in minutes. Trapped in the narrow alleys, crushed by the panic of the crowd with burning timber falling from above, medieval cities burned down constantly. It was a cycle. Build, burn, rebuild. Every night you went to sleep, you knew that if the baker down the street wasn't careful with his oven, you might not wake up. Mental health in the Middle Ages was misunderstood. If you heard voices, you weren't schizophrenic. You were possessed by demons. If you were depressed, it was a sin of despair. If you were unmanageable, you were sent to a place like Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, better known as Bedlam. It wasn't a hospital, it was a zoo. Patients were chained to the walls, they slept on straw that was rarely changed. They were whipped to beat the devil out. They were dunked in ice water to shock the system. And the public? They paid a penny to come and watch. On Sundays, families would visit Bedlam to look at the mad people for entertainment, poking them with sticks through the bars. There was no compassion, only fear and spectacle. To lose your mind in the Middle Ages was to lose your humanity. Maybe you think the answer is to escape, to join a monastery. It looks peaceful, stone walls, gardens, books. But monastic life was a different kind of endurance. The rule of St. Benedict was strict. You woke up at 2 a.m. for matins, prayers. The church was freezing. You stood on cold stone for hours chanting in the dark. You were not allowed to speak. Some orders took vows of perpetual silence. Imagine not speaking for 20 years. You worked in the scriptorium, copying Bibles by hand. It sounds romantic, but try writing on a parchment with a quill for 12 hours a day in a room with no heating. Monks suffered from terrible arthritis, eye strain, and repetitive stress injuries. They wrote complaints in the margins of the holy books. The ink is thin, my back hurts. It is freezing today. It was a life of rigid, cold, silent discipline. You were safe from war, yes, but you were a prisoner of the routine. We cannot finish without talking about the end of the world. It arrived in October 1347 on a ship docking in Sicily. The sailors on board were dead or dying. They had black swellings in their armpits. They were coughing blood. The harbour master ordered the ships out, but the rats had already scurried down the ropes. The Black Death had arrived. It moved north like a shadow. It moved faster than news could travel. You would be working in your field, and you would see a black flag on the church tower of the next village. Then the bell would start ringing. Then silence. It killed not just the weak, but the strong, young men, healthy women. In the morning you're fine, by noon you have a fever. By evening the buboes appear, black, painful lumps filled with pus. You smell the rot of your own body while you are still conscious. There is no cure, no prayer stops it, no herb slows it down. It was biological warfare against a population that didn't even know what a germ was. As the plague spread, reason vanished. People believed God was trying to wipe humanity off the earth. Groups called flagellants roamed the countryside, men and women marching in lines, whipping their own backs with leather scourges tipped with iron, singing hymns. They beat themselves until the blood ran down their legs, hoping to appease God's anger through pain. But instead of saving anyone, they just spread the disease faster, carrying the fleas from town to town on their bloody clothes. Others went the opposite way. They said, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." Taverns were full, people spent their life savings on wine and food, laws were ignored. Why pay your rent if the landlord is dead? Why save money if the world is ending on Tuesday? It was a time of total moral collapse. Even when there wasn't a plague, daily life was a minefield. Let's talk about the baker. In the medieval city, you bought your bread, but flour was expensive, so dishonest bakers used additives. To make the bread look white, which was for the rich, they added chalk, or crushed bones, or alum, a chemical used for bleaching. To make the loaf heavier, since bread was sold by weight, they might mix in sawdust, clay, or even dirt. Imagine eating a loaf of bread that is 10% sawdust and 5% chalk. Your stomach cramps. You get no nutrition. You slowly starve while eating a full meal. The punishment for a bad baker was public humiliation. He would be tied to a sled with the bad loaf tied around his neck and dragged through the muddy streets. But for every one they caught, 10 others were feeding you poison. Just to add one final layer of misery, the weather. We are in the Little Ice Age. Winters were brutal. In 1407, the frost was so hard that birds froze in midair and fell to the ground like stones. The Thames froze solid. Wine froze in the barrels and had to be sold by the chunk, like ice. People huddled in their huts, burning their furniture to stay alive. Wolves entered the villages of Paris, snatching dogs and sometimes children from the streets. You sat in your cottage, wrapped in every rag you owned, watching your breath turn to ice in the air, wondering if the sun would ever bring heat again. It was a test of endurance where the only prize for winning was seeing another frozen morning. So, was there any joy? Yes, but it was sharp and brief. A wedding dance in the barn, a successful harvest, the taste of fresh bacon after Lent. But these moments were islands in a sea of mud. The medieval peasant was a survivor of the highest order. He endured a world that was actively trying to kill him every day. He carried the weight of kings, castles, and cathedrals on his broken back. And he did it without painkillers, without central heating, and without hope of retirement. And so we come to the end of our long, dark journey. We have walked with the Vikings in the rain. We have smelled the streets of Rome. We have choked on the fog of London. We have shivered in the mud of the Middle Ages. History is often painted in gold and glory, but the reality was dirt, pain, smell, and exhaustion. So tonight, as you lie there, feel the weight of your blanket, dry and clean. Listen to the silence of your room, safe from wolves and wars. Take a deep breath of air that doesn't smell of smoke or sickness. You've survived another day in the most comfortable era in human history. You're safe, you are warm, the past cannot hurt you here. Rest now, good night.